Thank you, Doreen, and thank you, everybody, for coming. It's actually, for me, a great pleasure to be here. Santa Fe is widely known as a site for advanced thinking about many of the issues that are of concern to me. And so that poses a challenge. Although we have to acknowledge that we're all more or less of a like mind here. Typically, an activity of this sort is what we would loosely term preaching to the converted. Nonetheless, I need to make it worth your while. So I'm going to reaffirm you in some of your views and at the same time aspire to helping you gain some new perspectives, maybe some ideas that you hadn't had before. And I have to do all of that in a way which has a sort of positive and constructive tone to it. It's no sense just calling you all together and spending an hour telling you that you're doomed and there's nothing you can do about it. We will be talking tonight about ways to think of our future options. And when I say future, I don't mean your great-grandchildren. I'm talking about you, me, all of us, over the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years. It's been fascinating to me. I did our initial work back in 1972, and at that time, the issues we were concerned about lay far in the future. They don't lie far in the future anymore. We're in them. We're entering into that period now. Even for this group, where the average age is probably above the national average, I can say that you personally will see more change, let's say even over the next 10 years, than we have witnessed over the last 50, or maybe even over the last 100. Change in environmental issues, political issues, economics. Technology will change to some extent, although it's a little bit slower than cultural change. And our goal is to understand, we can't predict the future, but to at least understand some of the things that are coming and try to prevent the problems we can divert, and get ready to minimize the consequences of those which are more or less inevitable. And although it's very presumptuous of me, and I'm certainly not very well prepared to do that, I'll try to tie some of my remarks specifically to New Mexico and to Santa Fe. Before I get into my formal remarks, I would like to show you a little exercise that illustrates a couple of points which we need to keep in mind over the course of the discussion this evening. We have come to think about a lot of these issues in certain ways. Issues like overpopulation and water use and energy and so forth. Some of the ways that we think about them are useful and some aren't, and we're going to need to make some changes. I'm going to give you a little practice in doing that. Please cross your arms. Look down and see which wrist is on top. And remember that, okay? Now drop your arms. Great. And cross your arms again. And look down and see which wrist is on top. Okay, now let's do a little empirical analysis. Everyone who had the same wrist up both times, raise your hand. So, almost everybody. Of course, some of us have already forgotten if we had the both wrists up same, but probably those people tend to go along with the majority anyway. So, but generally speaking, it's most of us, which is in fact fine and what we would hope for. Crossing your arms is something that you do when you want to focus your attention elsewhere. And when you're confronted with something that doesn't require your arms, it would be really dysfunctional if you had to spend 5 or 10 minutes figuring out what to do with your arms so that you were free to focus on the matter at hand. So you develop a habit, one way or the other, and it works. and since it works, you can quit thinking about it and just use it whenever it's useful. Over the last 150 years, we've developed all sorts of habits related to growth and expansion and technological development and investment and our urban settlement patterns and so forth. Lots and lots of habits, which have become a sort of our starting point for thinking about things and our habitual solution to the issues that we face. But circumstances are changing, and some of those habits have got to change too. And as you'll see in a moment, that poses some interesting issues. Notice, incidentally, before we get into that, that although everybody tends to do arms crossing the same way, there's no optimal way to do it. I'll show you. Everyone who had the right hand up both times, raise your hand. Everybody who had your left hand up both times, raise your hand. See, it's about half and half. That's very common because there is, in fact, no optimum way. You just get into a habit, and that's what you do. Probably never occurred to you if you're a left-hander that half the world is going around crossing your arms the other way, but that's the way it is. Now I want you to cross your arms the other way. I'm waiting for the audience to come to rest here. Okay, so that little exercise illustrates 3 points we need to keep in mind tonight. First point, it is possible to change your habits. We will be able to make the changes that are required of us over the next decade or so, for sure. But, number two, as we experience, you may make mistakes at first. And you have to think about it. It isn't something you just automatically switch over. And many of the habits that we're going to have to change will also put us through a period where deliberation is required and where mistakes occur. It may seem like a trivial thing to say, but notice that we have set up a political system which is not very tolerant of uncertainty, mistakes, and deliberation. You know, when there's a big problem, we expect somehow our leaders are going to jump up and say, I can do it, and I know what to do, and here we go. When in fact, we're entering into a period where nobody knows what to do. They may have ideas, but I can say they do not have well-founded ideas because we're entering into a period which is going to be unique, certainly in our culture. So we need to be tolerant and to be aware of the fact that we're going to be making mistakes. And it means that we need to structure our activities in ways where failure is possible and even maybe attractive as a basis of learning. If we get ourselves into the situation where we're with the financial crisis of too big to fail, then we're in really big trouble because there's virtually no way that we will be able to negotiate this transition without making mistakes. And the third point was it's quite uncomfortable at first when you change your habits. And as we begin to develop new habits of land settlement, energy use, new aspirations for cultural activities for consumption and so forth, it will be uncomfortable, and there will be many people and many institutions which are extremely uncomfortable about it, not only psychologically, but in terms of their profit or their political influence, etc. And once again, if we're going to come through this period, we need to be aware of the fact that it's not going to be a majority vote and everybody off and running. It's going to be filled with debate, tension, disagreement, and that's just the nature of the process. So what am I going to do tonight about your habits of thought? I will very briefly describe some of the main ideas which emerged from our 1972 study. Let me assure you, I have actually done some creative work since 1972. I do have other things to talk about. But in fact, these ideas are now extremely relevant. And I figured it's more interesting to you than pork bellies. So I'm going to talk about the 72 study briefly. And then I'm going to segue from that to pinpointing two trends which, insofar as I can tell, are going to be very very serious disruptors also here. I mean, Santa Fe, because of its location, its culture, its affluence, has been able to isolate itself from a lot of the problems that occur around the globe. But you are not going to be able to insulate yourself from the energy crisis and climate change. So we'll talk about that briefly, and then I'll try to be more constructive about it. I'll describe what I might call the underlying foundations of the fossil fuel and the climate change issues. My main goal is to assure you, A, they are real, they are very important, and they are nigh. They are coming soon. In fact, we're already in it. And then, having laid that out, give you a few definitions or categorizations or habits of thought, different maybe than ones you've had in the past, which seem to me not to solve your problems, but to be a point of departure for doing constructive things here in Santa Fe. In 1972, I put together at MIT a team of 16 people to think about the long-term causes and consequences of physical growth on the planet. It was, in many ways, a very simplistic study. Many of the most important details of reality were left out, but I think we did a pretty good job of capturing the basic factors that govern growth in population, industrial output, resource consumption, and so forth. You can't predict the future, and so we used our computer model to generate a set of alternative scenarios. And this is the one which is sort of characteristic of our results. Goes from 1900 up to 2100. This red line shows where we were when we did the study, 1972. And here I'm plotting 5 variables: non-renewable resources, so the depletable resources, industrial output, food production, gross food production, population, and then persistent pollution. Persistent pollutants are the things which have a very long lifetime in the environment. Plutonium, for example, not let's say ozone, surface layer ozone. The main, let me just note parenthetically, in 1972, we still anticipated that on a global basis, growth would continue for another 30 or 40 years. That, of course, there are distributional differences, but on average, we would continue to see an expansion in the level of industrial activity, in total population, and so forth. We've gone back twice since 1972. We did it in 1994 and then again in 2004. Looked at recent data to see how we were doing. And what I can tell you, at this level of aggregation, we're basically on track. The only thing that's coming down during that period is non-renewable resources, and they're not coming down very much. Notice that even in 2000, we still have about 85% of what we started with. So basically, we expected 3 or 4 more decades of expansion. The thing was that the policies which produced that expansion, those habits, if you will, had the consequence of overshoot and collapse. So we were already at this time counseling the need for change. As you'll see in a moment, it was a counsel which didn't have massive impact. Here are some of the main lessons from Limits to Growth. We didn't expect any major global problems until 2010, 2050. But we also found that eventually the economic, political systems, the cultural values and so forth, which produce this phenomenal century of physical expansion, brought overshoot and collapse. This put us in direct opposition to many economists and others who felt that somehow there was in the existing system mechanisms that when it was necessary to slow down would produce that result and leave us in a fairly satisfactory state. We couldn't find them. we observed that the big pressures, which will be called problems by our politicians, occur before the peak, not after. You know, if I ask you, where do you think the population would be really suffering during this period, there's a tendency to imagine it must be out here. It's not the case. This is the period of intense pressure because it's in that period that the negative forces are building up in order to counteract the things that sustain growth. Finally, when you have overshoot and the growth stops, that means, by definition, that the forces which are sustaining growth have been offset by the forces which are counteracting it. The forces that are counteracting it, things like climate change and resource depletion and so forth, are what we call problems, and they are most intense in this period. Now, what's happening out here, I haven't a clue. It was always clear to us that as soon as things peaked out and started down, the global system would change in ways that certainly weren't reflected in our model. So I personally never paid the slightest attention. Indeed, in some of our publications, we just put a big white blot over that period because I don't think it gives us any useful information. We found that technology alone doesn't change the basic behavior of the system. We, in our model, tried all sorts of things. You know, we could double or triple resources. We could make assumptions about fabulous improvements in agricultural productivity and the enhanced ability to deal with toxic pollutants, and so forth. No matter what you assumed, you still had overshoot and collapse. You simply succeeded in deferring it by a few years and shifting the burden over onto other sectors. That has consequences now, I think, at least intellectually, for the debate about climate change, for example. People talk about climate change as though it's the problem. And, you know, if we could just solve that problem, everything would be okay. No. Climate change is one of the forces stopping growth. And even if you somehow managed to totally eliminate it, whatever that means, growth is still going to stop. There's still going to be overshoot and collapse, and it's still going to happen relatively soon. One of our contributions was to show that when you have exponential growth, it takes you to large numbers so quickly that no matter where the limits are, you're going to get there pretty quick. You don't need to know your limits to the third decimal point in order to know that they're quite close. So, you know, we put out our data. Here's global population. The red line shows where we were in 1972, and we said, you know, it's time to slow down. You can see it really had an enormous influence on the global population. Same thing with industrial production. These are illustrations, incidentally, from the book. From the more recent editions, because now we have empirical data past 1972. In 1972, our data just stopped there. These are not computer plots. These are empirical data. You see there's been a slight growth in industrial output per person because industry's grown faster than population, but of course the distribution hasn't been very good. There's been a tendency to imagine somehow we're moving into the information age and that growth doesn't matter anymore because it doesn't have a material aspect to it. That's totally false. Here shows world metals use, for example, 1972 and recently. And as a consequence of the fact that we continue to sustain these physical growth trends, it is now manifestly the case that the planet has gone past its limits, which puts the whole question of sustainable development into a new context. What does it mean, sustainable development, if we know absolutely for sure that we need to come back down drastically? This whole issue of carrying capacity is a very complex one. It involves all sorts of discussions about values and technological advance and so forth. The person who's done, in my mind, the best job of tackling it is Matthias Wackernagel, a Swiss scientist who currently lives in the States, has an organization called the Global Footprint, I don't know, Inc. or something. And they take empirical data, convert it over to generate curves of this sort. This is an oversimplistic curve. It's assuming, for example, that the world's biocapacity, its capacity to support people, isn't changing. And we know for sure that when you exceed the carrying capacity of a system, you begin to deteriorate that carrying capacity. Matas knows that, but to take that green line and run it down would introduce a whole new set of criticisms for his work, which he just doesn't need to deal with. I mean, he already makes the point that's necessary. In 72, we were here, roughly, and at that point, it was still possible to slow down, in theory. We thought so, anyway. Now we're up here at about 140% above, and actually accelerating. Recent data shows that the damage or the demands against the ecosystem are accelerating. And the reason we can be over the carrying capacity, at least for a period of time, is the same reason you can overspend your bank account. For a short period, if you've been accumulating savings, you can spend more than you put in. But of course, you draw your balance down, and eventually you have to stop doing that. We're now drawing down our balance. We're using up our fossil fuels, our wildlife diversity, our agricultural soils, our groundwater, and soon, Matas and I don't know what soon means, but it's not, but it's going to be during your lifetime, I would guess. These curves have to come back down again. How they'll come down, how the reductions will be distributed across the planet, what will the implications for the environment, for our culture, for our lifestyle, these are extremely interesting issues, which I would say are still quite open for us to think about and to influence. I mean, there wouldn't be any point of a conversation like this if we didn't imagine we still have some level of influence over the future. And of course, although this is globally, it's not only globally that this is happening. This shows the same analogous calculations for the United States. I looked to see if there exists a calculation of this sort for New Mexico. I couldn't find it, but if there were one, it would show a gap, of course, very much bigger between your demands and your capacities. Your imports of energy and other materials are very much greater than the indigenous capacity for production. But this is the United States. And here, incidentally, when we come down to this level, you begin to see that the biocapacity is going down. There are a few countries in the world where the demands are still below the capacity, but by and large, the tendency is the one that you see here. And it manifests in many ways. There's all sorts of unsustainable trends. I mean, and you know this. I mean, you read about it in your papers. You're overpumping your groundwater. You're certainly using far more fossil fuels than are produced in your state. And globally, we're drawing down our fossil fuel reserves. There's also a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Destruction of agricultural soils or diversion of agricultural soils into other uses, and degradation of renewable resources. You know, the renewable resources are the things that can regenerate, fish, forests, and so forth. It is the case that today, every single renewable resource on every single continent, with the possible exception of Antarctica, is being used non-sustainably. There is not one single example that I've been able to find, or that anyone's told me about, where on a continental scale, we're using a renewable resource in a way such that the regeneration equals our demands against the resource. Fish are going down, forests are going down, you know, and so forth. So we're clearly in unsustainable territory. And as Amory Lovins likes to say, I don't know if he gave a lecture here last year, but he was at the school last year, if something can't continue, it probably won't. Let's look at two trends which I think are of particular interest here: energy and climate. They're different in some important ways, even at the level of what you can do about them. But in both cases, they are going to have a very, very significant influence on your life here. You're not able to buy your way out of either of these. There are some kinds of problems which are broadly spread across the globe, like disease, hunger, certain other problems, where because of the intellect, the blessings of a relatively honest and orderly political system, your level of affluence and so forth, you've been able to isolate yourself by and large. But in these two cases, you won't be able to do that. Let's take the first one, energy. Oil has been around, of course. It's been around forever. It's been used for thousands of years. Darius the Great, 4 to 600 BC, was using oil but on a relatively modest basis. They ran little oil lamps with it and used it in some medicines. The first oil well in the United States was brought in about 1859, so 150 years ago. But it's only been very recently that we've gotten ourselves into an oil-intensive lifestyle. I was born in 1942. Over 95% of all the oil that has ever been used in human history, all 200,000 or more generations of our species, over 95% has been used since I was born. We tend to look around at our current system and sort of take it for granted as something that's always been like that and is inevitable. It's not. It's a microscopic blip in the habitation of our species on this planet. You can see that although we've been using oil all the way back to the first well, that even, so I was born just here. The vast bulk of the oil has been used since then. And if I manage to live another 10 or 15 years, probably I will have lived long enough to see 85 or 90% of all the oil that is ever used in human history be consumed. Because there's emerging evidence that oil production has peaked out. There's good evidence that global oil production reached its maximum in 2005 and is now in a period of oscillation, which is obscured by a lot of other things like the economic crisis and so forth, but that the prospects in the future are down. That seems surprising to people who haven't thought about it. It seems almost like it can't be true, but it is true. We have not found as much oil as we've used in a year since 1984. 1984 was the last time that the cumulative discoveries of oil globally were greater than the cumulative use of oil. I don't have it here, but we're at a level now where consumption, annual consumption, is something like 5 or 6 times annual discoveries. We're drawing down the huge discoveries that were made earlier, typically actually before the 70s even. Now, you read these stories about like the great Brazilian oil discovery off the coast of Brazil. Well, it's great for Brazil, but I mean, if you assumed you could have all that oil instantly available to you, which you can't, it's a few days of global consumption, maybe a month. It's not something which is a game changer. We are now moving into the post-petroleum age. That shows you discoveries and use, and the crossover point's around about 1984. Again, these are deceptively simple. The question about how much oil you really have is complex. Depends on certain assumptions about price, technology, who owns it. There are a lot of issues. So, although, in the nature of a two-dimensional graph, you do have to have a part that's under the curve and a part that's over the curve. You really should imagine these as kind of fuzzy boundaries. But nonetheless, the trends are down. Oil production peaked out in the United States in 1971. There was a time when we were the world's greatest oil producer. there was actually a time when we were the world's greatest oil exporter. I remember, I wasn't personally there, but I read about when in about 1950, M. King Hubbert, based on someone who was a Shell petroleum geologist, on the basis of empirical studies, projected that global or that U.S. oil production would peak out in about 1970. He was, I think, even literally hooted out of the room. It was such an extraordinarily crazy, lunatic idea that nobody, or at least certainly nobody in the establishment, took it seriously. More or less by accident, he was right. I mean, it wasn't 70, but it was 71. And there's no longer any prospect whatsoever that we would be able, on a basis of our own domestic resources, to bring oil production back up above its 1971 levels. And as you know, the gap between what we use and what we produce is now causing us enormous problems. It's a major source of our import debt, for example. Oil is a finite resource unless you subscribe to a small group of people who think that it's somehow being continuously generated under the surface of the earth. It's not a joke. I mean, there are people who hold that view. I don't hold it, and it's not certainly not a prevalent view. But as soon as you imagine it's finite, then of course, as you use it, you have less and less. It peaked in the United States in 71. Most of the major oil-producing countries, most of the countries that produce oil are now post-peak. And some of the important reserves for us, the ones that we rely on, like in Mexico and Canada, are also post-peak. This is the Cantarell field in Mexico, which has been a major source of revenue for the Mexican government and also a big source of our oil imports. Just here, depletion started to cause problems for them, and they developed some new technologies of high-pressure gas injection. And you see it was a great success. It boosted their production up, but now they're in very steep decline and virtually no prospect that it'll bring it back up. And it's one of the main reasons you're starting to see really significant economic and political problems in Mexico, because that source of income is gone. And of course, it's going to start causing problems for us here in the United States as well, because we've been dependent on that to some extent. The easy oil is gone, not to beat this too far into the ground, but it's been, for me at least, astonishing that something which is so central to our society and economy remains so much the subject of ignorance and myth. So I mean, it's important to understand what the reality is. Oil discoveries peaked in the 60s. They started to come down. Consumption was still going up. That's why they crossed in 84. Here's the numbers. In 2006, globally, we discovered about 9 billion barrels, and we used 31 billion barrels. Of the world's, as it turns out, most oil comes from big fields. There are thousands and thousands of fields, but most of them are quite small. And it's a few giant fields which really give you the bulk of your oil. Of the world's 20 largest oil fields, 18 were discovered before 1968, 2 were discovered in the 70s, and none have been discovered since then. So we're in a period where we're simply living off those big fields. Oil production was lower in 2007 than it was in 2006. It was lower in 2008 than it was in 2007. We don't know yet about 2009, and plus there's all these confounded influences because of the economic problems. But as I said, there's an emerging consensus that 2005 was probably the peak. This was studied, and so we're looking at something like this. How quickly it goes down, extremely interesting issue. There's a lot of debate about it. A study which was done recently in Germany said that probably, or they expected that by 2030, oil production would be at half current levels. That's a rapid rate of decline, given that oil is the overwhelming foundation for the transportation sector and is about 40% of global primary energy overall. I have some alarming statistics here about the energy gap. I won't bother to get into it except to say, and this is not just speculation, it's based on some study of my own and others, there is virtually no chance whatsoever that we will be able to bring on alternative energy sources, renewable energy sources, and energy efficiency quickly enough to make up the gap. Absolutely important to make our use of energy more efficient, absolutely important to stimulate renewable energy source installation and production as much as we can, but we need to understand that there's no possibility of avoiding really, really serious discontinuities, even so. I have a friend, Matt Simmons, who's probably the biggest independent financial investor in, or not investor, but a financier in fossil fuel production. He organizes $100 million loans for companies that need the money to plow into exploration and drilling. So he sits at the front line. He says he thinks that he will live to see $200 a barrel oil. It's about $80 now, briefly peaked at 160 and was enormously disruptive when it did. I think he's wrong. Our system can't function with $200 a barrel oil. There wouldn't, at $200 a barrel, there wouldn't be the demand there necessary to, to sustain the industry. But I think, but on the other hand, you can't consume what you don't have. So I would say that we're moving into a period where quotas and other non-price mechanisms will start to be employed as a way of allocating it, sort of like during the war. During the war, we considered it was unacceptable that the rich could have as much oil as they wanted and the poor just went without. So we instituted some kind of rationing system. It wasn't perfect, but it's what we did. And I assume we're moving back into that period now. This is confounded by an issue which is not widely understood, and that's what we call net energy. All barrels are not created the same. If you have to spend 12 barrels of oil, energy equivalent, to pull 10 out of the ground, this is not a very profitable enterprise, certainly not the basis for sustaining your society. And we are in a period where the net energy available to us out of our energy systems is declining radically. I mean, stands to reason. In the old days, when you drilled well by sort of poking a stick in the ground and then jumping back and holding your bucket out to collect the oil, there were very high returns, 100 to 1. Now you need to go out into the deep sea, drill down 5,000 feet, and then through 2,000 or 3,000 feet of rock, and you have to ship it back home. Obviously, under those circumstances, the net return on investment is going to be much smaller. And this explains why the tar sands and the oil shales are never going to be a really important resource for us. Their net energy return is down around 2 or 3 at best, and that's ignoring the environmental damage that they cause. We built our country on an energy system where the payback was 30, 50, 70 to 1. And we will not be able to sustain it with an energy system where the payback is 2 or 3 to 1. Just can't. Any more than you can run the same business which has a 70-fold profit margin once your profit margin drops down to a few percent. It's just a different business. You can do it. There are things that are useful to do. It's not the end of history, but it's just going to be really, really different. We're starting to see this. Economic indicators are used as a surrogate, and they're very confusing, partly because the fossil fuel industry is politically very powerful and has been able to command phenomenal subsidies. So they have been able to obscure what's really going on. A recent calculation was that the oil industry gets about $2 billion a day in subsidies around the globe. That's roughly $750 billion a year. Obviously, if you're running a business where public authorities are pumping $2 billion a day into your business, you're free to change price in ways that don't necessarily reflect the underlying reality, and that's what's happening. Nonetheless, we're beginning to see the consequences. This is a recent, these are official data, they're not my data, showing United States energy expenditures as a percent of GDP from 1999 up to 2008. And you see there's a rather remarkable rise. And it's not only, of course, nationally. Here I was able to come up with some New Mexico data. This is Maine, my neighboring state. It has a higher energy intensity, partly because it's colder, partly because a lot of its economy is based on paper production, which is inherently a very energy-intensive industry. But even in case of New Mexico, you see a significant secular rise. I mean, we're talking about over 50% growth in a decade. This is important. This is money which isn't available elsewhere in the economy. It's not going to be available for schools or for culture or for transport or for other useful purposes. And I would say that we're now in a period where the costs are going to start escalating faster and faster. Whether they manifest as price or start to be some other kind of cost, the length of time you have to wait at the station until your turn comes up, or what you have to give up in order to get the coupon, or whatever it is. The cost, in one way or another, is going to start going up. So it's important for us to understand this and to see where we can intervene. Here in Santa Fe, you do not have the possibility of reversing global oil production and consumption trends. But you have enormous scope for preparing yourself to function adequately in a period where energy is much less available. Let's look at it. Oil consumption, and it's my equation, it's again pretty simplistic, but it generates some interesting insights. Oil consumption is equal to the number of people times the unit of capital per person. This is your material living standard, in a way. So it's your car and your house, but it's also a little piece of this theater, which you're consuming tonight, times the amount of energy which is required to operate the capital. That's an energy efficiency. If we were to switch these spotlights over to LED lights, then this number would go down a little bit, at least for that part of your capital, which is this theater. And then times the fraction of energy from oil. So let's look at this, because what's happened, and generally happens for a whole class of problems, is that there's a strong emphasis over here. We really like technology. The people who sell the technology make a lot of money. The politicians can advocate it and generate jobs. It's a very attractive side of the equation. Much less interest in thinking about the social or the cultural side. But it is unfortunately the case, as long as there's growth here, you could do whatever you want to over here, and it isn't going to reduce oil consumption. I think in Santa Fe, so far as I understand it, on the basis of very slight reading and so forth, you're working away over here. You're trying to put in bike lanes, and there are state renewable energy incentives, and I don't know about your building codes. Probably they're starting to increase required energy efficiency. You need double pane windows now instead of single pane windows, stuff like that. You're working over here. I'm sure you could do it better, but progress is being made. Nothing's going on over here. Well, for example, here's your population. This is the Santa Fe population. 1960 up to 2000, from 60,000 up to 140,000, more than double. I just read through the Sustainable Santa Fe plan. Guess what? Population doesn't show up. It's just not in there. Lifestyle is not in there. There's no appeals to lowering your material standard of living. A lot about organic agriculture and renewable energy and stuff, which is all very useful. But until we really come to grips with the problem, we're not going to solve it. So this is an interesting place to start thinking, both at the family level, city level, state level. What can we do? You can't use what you don't have. you're not going to have as much oil, collectively, the globe is not, as it has had. And it will be less disruptive here if you can foresee the problems and prepare for them rather than just sit back. I mean, it's better to have an energy to ride your bicycle than it is to have a Hummer which doesn't have any gas in its tank. I think, in theory. And so that's what we're talking about, is, proactively starting to try and stabilize these and bring them down. I'll come back in the question and answer period about energy. I could talk about energy at length. I've just had the very extremely interesting experience of a massive program on my own house to increase energy efficiency and install a solar system. It gave me all sorts of practical insights I didn't used to have when I was talking about these things. Let's switch very quickly to climate. That's much more discussed. It's quite a bit more outside of your control, so I won't spend so much time on it. Just reiterate a couple of main points. This curve, incidentally, appeared in our first book. In 1972, we already had these data, and we cited them as an example of exponential growth in a persistent pollutant. We weren't in 72 so concerned about climate change. It wasn't, part of the vernacular, but we said you need to slow down, and of course you can see what's happened. And actually the rate at which we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere is accelerating. It's not going down. I think we can rightfully lambaste the United States for obstructing and not being a signatory to the Kyoto Accord. But everybody who signed this Kyoto Accord also has growing CO2 emissions. In a few cases, the data are confusing because Britain, for example, doesn't take credit for all the CO2 which is produced in China in the process of manufacturing the goods that they import into Great Britain. But if you take that into account, we're all going up. Some people, as you well know, it's a source of enormous debate about, is there climate change? If there is it natural? Is it man-caused? If it's going on, should we do something about it? Should we be concerned about it? If we do something about it, should we do it now or we should do it later? How much is it going to cost? Those are interesting issues, but I won't take your time with them here. Let me just make one point, which I think is crucially important. There is a body of opinion which says, yes, climate change is going on, but don't worry. We shouldn't do anything about it now. It's too expensive to do something about it now. Let's wait. A prominent advocate of that point of view is Nordhaus, a Yale economist. He grew up in Albuquerque, but he's now at Yale. And for example, in 2007, he critiqued the Stern Review, which was, as you know, a massive attempt to think about this issue of timing and cost. Stern was an economist, actually a senior economist at the World Bank, so the normal practice of saying, oh, well, my God, you're not an economist, what do you know about this stuff, didn't work. So Nordhaus pulled back and said, wrong discount rate. Stern has a low discount rate, and he said it should be a high discount rate, and the difference is if it's a high discount rate, then don't do it now, do it later. I just want to point out something. Relying on this, what's called net present value as a way of making decisions, has embedded in it 5 crucial assumptions, which of course Nordhaus never pointed out to anybody, probably he's even unaware of them, largely. First assumption, all future consequences are known. When you're pulling back the costs and benefits of something, you're assuming you do know what they are. All consequences can be expressed in monetary units, which means that the effects are commensurate. You can put them all down to a single denominator. As soon as you start getting into incommensurate impacts, then we move outside the field of economics into the field of politics, and Nordhaus certainly wouldn't want us to do that. So he says basically that you can reduce them all down to numbers, monetary numbers. We also assume that our generation is the one that should be entitled to pick the interest rate, not the future. Your grandchildren might have a different opinion about what interest rates we should have used for calculating costs and benefits of future action, but we are assuming we get to pick. It's also assuming that maximizing financial benefit is, in fact, our underlying goal. I mean, you could have the goal of, let's say, maintaining an environment in a high-quality condition, or you could have a goal of equity or something else. No, it's assuming that the goal is to maximize the net present value of financial benefits. And there's also implicit the notion in this whole kind of analysis that if you do make a mistake, you can buy your way back out of it in the future. Every single one of those assumptions is wrong. Totally wrong for climate change. You know, if you want to decide whether to buy a car now or buy a car next year, whether to repair a stove or buy a new stove, net present value starts to be an interesting way to structure the decision. But when you're talking about climate change over decades, it's just totally irrelevant. So when somebody gets up to you and says, there is climate change, but don't worry, we shouldn't do anything about it, just remember that they're basing that conclusion on an underlying theory which is ridiculously false. So what to do about it? Well, here again, I can give you one of these equations. This is analogous, as you've no doubt noticed, to the energy one, and it makes the same points. CO2 emissions equal the number of people times the unit of capital per person, times the energy required to operate that capital, times the fraction of the energy from fossil fuels. CO2 comes from fossil fuels, so if we can run our capital on solar energy, at least once we get the solar energy in place, then we aren't emitting CO2. But for the moment, most of what we operate comes from fossil fuel-fired power sources. Once again, there's a distinction between technology and sociology. And once again, you notice the overwhelming concern is on the right side of the equation. We're working very hard. Obama, talks about renewable energy and energy efficiency, and there's federal incentives and state incentives and so forth. All fine. But as long as we don't take into account growth in people and in living standards, it's to no avail. I know, unfortunately, that these two have the capacity to grow much faster and longer than can be offset by anything we could imagine to do over here. And it's for that reason that CO2 is still continuing to grow everywhere. So what? Well, now we come down to the Santa Fe. There's two types of problems. I find it's useful to just differentiate between global problems and universal problems. Global problems affect everybody, and they require everybody to act in concert for their solution. There's no way Santa Fe people are going to prevent climate change. Universal problems are ones which affect everybody, but you can actually do something here. You could quit overpumping your groundwater here without having China quit overpumping its groundwater. So I'm saying focus on the universal problems, because there's where you actually have some leverage. And there's two types of policies, adaptive and preventive. Preventive do prevent the problem. Adaptive basically try to minimize its negative consequences for you. In your case, mainly what's interesting here is adaptive. You're not going to prevent oil depletion, you're not going to prevent climate change, but there are all sorts of adaptive things you could do here. Unfortunately, and you are doing them to some extent, but not nearly fast enough. We're talking about problems which are going to manifest very soon, and you're engaged in a process which somehow imagines, that 50 or 60 years from now, we got to get ourselves into a different state. You need to get yourself into a different state 5 or 10 years from now, maximum. I talk about easy and difficult problems. The thing is quite simple. Easy problems are where if you do something constructive, it looks good in the short term as well as solving the problem. Difficult problems are where if you do something constructive, it makes things look worse in the short term in order to solve the problem. Take energy. If we want energy to be relatively available in the country, we need to make it relatively less available now by taxes or quotas or something. Our political system does not deal with difficult problems very well. People want to be reelected, and typically the next election is going to come just exactly at that point where the constructive problems, the solutions don't look very good. And so the idea is that we really need to find ways, nationally, locally, to increase our time horizon. The difference between easy and difficult problems is really one of time horizon. If you look out far enough, all problems become easy in this sense. Doesn't mean effortless, but at least conceptually you know what to do, and you probably can do it. How do you increase? I have some slides about that. That's a difficult problem. And if the next election is here, guess what your elected leaders are going to do? They want something that looks good. They don't want to be in the midst of the pits. This is going to be the Democrats' problem at the next election. I mean, there's no way you take the economic mess we've gotten ourselves into and turn it around quickly. And there's going to be a lot of unhappy people at the time of the next election. So we need to start thinking about increasing our time horizon. And here, if you are able to convert the sort of theoretical level down to the practical level, all sorts of things begin to emerge, even at the level of Santa Fe. Give power to the government councils that last longer than short-term elections. I don't know enough about Santa Fe to understand your local governance system, but decisions are made by different groups and people, and they have different time horizons, and it's a question of shifting the power over to those who are looking further out. You can do that by long-term appointments, by giving people direct access to the press so that they aren't censored by short-term politicians who don't want to look bad. There's lots of things you can do. Reduce the influence of short-term financial interests. There are lots of things here. Lobbying laws, governing your financial contributions. Also things like starting local currencies. There's a nascent effort here in this town to create some kind of Santa Fe hour type local currency. Local currencies are fascinating. There are thousands of them around the world, and some of them are very big. And they offer opportunities which you do not have when you are locked into a fiat currency system like the dollar. For example, you can create a local currency system that has negative interest rates as well as positive ones. Negative interest rates mean you want to spend the money quickly. Positive interest rates mean you want to put it in the bank and let it get bigger. You can give incentives to some parts of the society to have a longer term perspective. The media and the church are places where, in theory at least, you could have a longer term perspective. Some countries have royalty. Royalty can be quite a useful way to bring a longer term perspective into place. If you think your kids and your grandchildren are going to have to make a living off the place, you're less likely to trash it over the short term. Study history. People tell me over and again, the species can't do that, and they're thinking about the last 100 years. We've been on this planet for 200,000 or 300,000 of years. And so until you really get a sense about the longer sweep, you really don't know what is within our capacity. Improve our understanding about complex systems and develop new measures of well-being. There, I think Santa Fe is quite far advanced. You clearly have a sense about well-being different from many other parts of the country and much more consistent with sustainable development. Thank you.
Dennis will take some questions. Those of you who want to leave now can leave, and we'll take some questions. So, Dennis has the mic. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Please stand up in the back and yell.
As you couldn't well imagine, over the last 40 years, I have encountered a few criticisms and objections. So if you have some, don't feel hesitant to voice them. It's always useful to look at how you're wrong instead of how you're right. So, I'll repeat your question, so don't, go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm slightly hard of hearing, and so if people are talking, then I can't understand what he's saying. If you want to talk, just go outside. It's fine with me, but just don't do it in here. So please start again. Yes. Well, I can talk a lot about technology. Let me say, I'm not against technology. I have a degree in chemistry. I work for the Atomic Energy Commission. A lot of my students, former students, work at the Los Alamos. I'm absolutely wildly enthusiastic about technology, certain kinds of technology. But I observed in the course of my modeling that it doesn't eliminate problems. And empirically, we see that it has not. I mean, we've come through a period of phenomenal technological progress, and we have bigger problems now than we ever had. So clearly, it's not solving these problems. The confusing thing about technology is that it's a very nebulous concept. We talk about it as so it's sort of monolithic, independent entity out there which is going to come in and solve our problems. Of course, it's not like that. Technology is embedded in our relationship to our tools. And it takes a long time to develop technology in most cases, and technology is developed by people who have a vested interest in it. That's why, for example, we spend more money developing technology for killing people in this country than we do on technology for reducing the birth rate, because there are more people around with money and technical prowess who will make a profit from killing people, indirectly, of course, through the military, than by reducing the birth rate. So technology isn't sort of homing in automatically and instantly on those problems that we need to have solved. Not to say that we shouldn't work to develop renewable energy and new efficiency techniques and so forth, yes. But it just isn't going to eliminate the need for behavioral, cultural, psychological change. Never has, and it's not going to do it now. And if that, and I'm sure I haven't in any way changed your opinion on the matter. I've just expressed my own views. But we observe, let's say, in the climate change debate, that despite all of this activity and frenzy and money for things, still the problem's getting worse. I might note parenthetically about climate change that even if we could come up with the technologies which would permit us to take greenhouse gas emissions, all of them, not only CO2, but all of the other greenhouse gases, down to zero tomorrow, we would still have drastic, deleterious climate change for centuries. See, technology doesn't circumvent the delays which are embedded in natural systems. There are pipelines there which, once they get churning, aren't going to be shut down by some invention that we have. So that's why I'm an advocate for technology. I use it myself and consider myself better off for having access to the internet and being able to put solar collectors on my house and so forth. But I don't for a moment imagine that it's going to eliminate these problems. I'm sorry. I'm pleased to do it, but express your question in a different way. So
Oh, sure. It just seems counterintuitive or
counter to your intuition. Counter to your intuition.
my intuition, but also counter to a lot of the, for example, with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, quotas and tariffs, etc., have been reduced, and in fact legally, through a number of systems. And it just seems culturally that we've really shifted away from a culture of rationing and quotas towards this idea of free choice. And I'd just be interested to hear you kind of talk about going back to a kind of quota or rationing for consumers.
Okay. I apologize. Can someone so
About rationing, Dennis. You mentioned we might have to ration
yeah.
oil again.
Okay. So
You said that's culturally not the way we've been headed.
yes. So thank you. You're of course absolutely right. The thrust of change, certainly in the West, since the Second World War, and even prior to that, has been to put more and more reliance on the market, so-called the market, for making these allocational decisions. It's worked fine for the rich because they are able to place high demands on the system and get what they want. It hasn't worked very well for the poor. That's why the gap is opening up. But I was looking at something different. I believe, oil production is going to fall precipitously over the next few decades. Whether it'll be 50% or 30%, I don't know. And probably it's not knowable, and it's not even set yet what it will do, but it's going to go down. And I said, this will open up a gap between what we wanted to have and what we actually have, which cannot be bridged by renewable sources and efficiency measures. So then comes the question, since you can't use what you don't have, how do we bring demand, which is currently projected to grow by about 40% between now and 2030, down to the level which can be sustained by what we actually have? One way you can do that in theory is by letting the price go up. And then the people who can pay the price get it, and the people who can't pay the price don't get it. I hope that in a democracy, and I don't mean a place where you put votes in the box, but a culture like ours, which has concern for the poor and in some senses of egalitarianism and so forth. I hope that in a democracy, we won't let price be the sole allocating mechanism, because it would mean the rich get more or less what they want and the poor are really left out. The Second World War was a period where, for different reasons, demand was different than supply, and there we used rationing as an allocation mechanism. It had all sorts of problems, and of course some people circumvented it, no question about that. I mean, there's no perfect system here. I think that's what we're going to see. I actually bet in Germany 3 or 4 years ago with somebody that we would see rationing in Germany before 2020, rationing of oil. And the reason is simply because the price would have to go so high to make demand equal supply, or consumption equal availability, that it would not be politically acceptable. I think even in our country, politicians would pull back and say, listen, that's just not acceptable to do it that way. So they'll find something else. Will it be quotas or rationing, or I don't know. I mean, it's not my field of study, but I'm just saying it will be non-economic. It will not be purely price. It will be something else. We are experienced in non-economic rationing systems. I tried to go to a very popular breakfast restaurant in Santa Fe the other day. I got there, it was a long line. I said, forget it. The restaurant is using waiting time as a way to set its consumption equal with its capacity. It also uses price, but of course they could also just raise the price of their breakfast up to about $50, and then there wouldn't be long lines anymore. Only the rich would go and have breakfast there. They chose not to do that. So I mean, we do this routinely. It's not something brand new. And I'm just saying I think it's going to start happening in energy. Yeah.
You listed a large number of factors that would make the transition from now to the future to be easier, like reducing demand for short-term profitability, things of that nature. Under the present system and present thinking, that seems to be unlikely for the next 10, 15 years or so. So I was wondering, what is your thinking on that failure to lead to social instability, and the social instability to lead to a sharp decrease of world population?
Well, of course, we could structure a college course around that question. I'll try to be a little more succinct. to summarize, I just at the end put up a slide which was, I think, labeled How to Increase the Time Horizon. The idea being that if people could look out further at the costs and benefits of the options they have, they would start to make more right choices. It's only when you have a very short-term perspective and you gauge the costs and benefits over the most immediate future to decide what you want to do that you start to make wrong choices. I mean, like an alcoholic. If an alcoholic just wants to be happy over the next couple of hours, he or she will keep drinking. It's only if the alcoholic could be brought to start thinking about 6 or 8 months into the future that the consequences of drinking are more, start to become significant in connection with the benefits. So it's this question of time horizon. You're also correct in saying that the changes which I listed there don't seem likely very soon. Certainly not on a global or even a national basis. I put them up thinking that they are tenable at the level of, let's say, Santa Fe. I mean, they're not easy and they're not quick, but if a relatively small group of people set out to imbue more decision-making power in institutions that have a longer-term time horizon, or set out to create a local currency so that a slightly different set of financial decisions began to govern investment and consumption activity, or any of these other things, I think you could succeed. But on the global basis, not. It isn't going to happen. Hasn't happened. I don't think it's going to. If anything, our capacity for radical change declines as you come into the crisis. I mean, we saw that with the financial collapse 18 months ago. I mean, when it happened, I mean, there was virtually no flexibility in Congress or the White House. They just desperately started throwing money at the system, trying to get it back into its former condition. No thought about structural change at all. And even now, the new legislation is not significantly changing the structure. So we can then, in our line of reasoning, say, well, okay, we need to do these things. We're not going to do them, so there's going to be crisis. One manifestation of the crisis may be significant declines in global population. You can't support 9 billion people on this planet if you have very, very low aspirations for material well-being and personal liberty. As soon as you would like to have a global population that enjoys the liberties and the consumption standards in the West, then you can't have 9 billion. You need 1 or 2 billion max. And, getting there implies some kind of decline. Yes, that's true. Now, I mean, we can go on from there. Is it going to happen? When's it going to happen? How could we make it less? These are all interesting questions. I'll just say, not to foreclose conversation about it, but I don't think we're going to make the fundamental changes that we need to make. We haven't so far. And the consequences are going to be rapidly escalating crises, more and more frequent, bigger and bigger magnitude, until finally change does occur. But it won't be proactive. It will be retroactive. You will conserve energy because you don't have it, not because you anticipate that you're not going to have it. There it is. That's the nature of our species. I used to be depressed about that. Now I'm not. I mean, happiness, I'm about to tell you something that's moderately profound. Happiness is having what you want. There are 2 ways to become happy or happier. Remember our habits. Our habitual way of becoming happier is to get more. But you can also be happy by wanting less. And I've simply adjusted my expectations. I put on the list of measures, study history. History is wonderful. I mean, as ghastly as you think it may be in the future, it's nothing compared with what our species has come through over the last 10 or 20,000 years. We've come through some incredibly awful times. The landmass, which is Great Britain, was settled by humans 9 times. The first 8 times it didn't work. They got totally wiped out and pushed off. Now we're in the 9th. We'll see if it works. So when you start to have a sense of history, we're coming into some interesting changes. But I mean, we'll do it one way or another. Yeah.
I just want to take this opportunity, because I never thought I could do this in person, to thank you for what you've done. I taught at LaSalle High School environmental courses, and I used limits to growth for dozens of students whose lives were changed, and the focus and the life choices they've made were very much indebted to you for that.
Well, to the book. Yes, thank you. You're very kind. Yeah. So you said there's some person who has a negative comment. Where is that person? Is that you? Good. Go for it.
The Marxists who believe that the economic system should be ordered more towards the satisfaction of needs rather than desires. And I wonder what you think of that.
When we get into a discussion about this issue of needs versus desires, we have to become very much more precise about our vocabulary. What is a need and what is it? Some people's desires are other people's needs and so forth. I don't view that particular dichotomy as a fruitful way to enter into the discussion. Markets aren't uniform. I mean, the market, the system for allocation and choice which exists, let's say, in China, is phenomenally different from the market which exists in Italy or the United States or Mexico. So markets, we have this one term which we use in a very imprecise way. And the ways in which markets malfunction are, for me, not in this issue of needs versus desires. They're off in questions of time horizon, question of influence. I mean, it's always been interesting for me. Listen, I have a PhD in management. I'm not against management either, but I at least I observe it. It's always been interesting to me that the people who most vociferously defend the market are the ones who most actively work to subvert it for their own purposes. I mean, look at it. You'll see it. That's the way it works. The guys who are really advocating the market are meanwhile advertising or patenting or doing other things to try and make the market not, nobody wants to exist in a perfectly competitive system because the profit margins are very low and the uncertainty is very high. Everybody wants to have patent protection and et cetera. So they don't like the market. They like the market for everybody else, but just not for themselves. And getting off into those issues, I think, is a more interesting place to start. And for me, I'm particularly concerned with the ways in which you can alter the market on the margin. We're not going to, I don't think the dollar system, I don't think Wall Street functions to the best interest of our society, but I don't imagine that I have any capacity whatsoever to change either of them. But I can start a local currency system in a locality, or I can create a new kind of bank which lends out of different criteria. And so there's some things in the margin you can do. That's where I'm looking at the market for changes. Getting off into these philosophical debates about desires and needs and so forth, it just doesn't, at least for me, I'm a very practical guy, it doesn't take me off in a constructive direction. Sorry.
One more question, and you pick one more question.
You pick. I don't know.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm very interested in this issue of population and have been for 30 years. But it is almost a taboo subject. People are not interested in it. Many vested interests, such
We're past 6. Well, I'm an academic, so I give you a theoretical answer. It's totally simple. If the birth rate is greater than the death rate, population goes up. If the birth rate is lower than the death rate, population goes down. Now, of course, the birth rate can be lower than the death rate under 2 conditions: low fertility and long lifetime, or high fertility and a short lifetime. We have that. I'm sorry, I made a mistake, but you get the point. This can be bigger than this at high levels or at low levels, and generally, our cultures value long lives. Healthy, long-lived people is a good in most cultures. Cultures are less uniform in their thoughts about fertility, but generally speaking, it's assumed that living longer is better and living healthier is better. So how's that going to happen? Well, globally, this gets off into a set of issues which are scientifically difficult, subject to enormous value judgments, and politically sensitive. And so, and I'm not, of course, perfectly informed about it. I'll just share with you a few of my own perceptions. I don't present them as truth, and I earnestly hope many of you will have different views. I'll just tell you what my views are. Population is going to go back down globally. I honestly don't know from what level and when. I just don't know. For many reasons, but it's a question because it brings in a set of political and cultural. We're not talking about pure biological survival. Biologically, we can support a very large number of people on this planet, but when you start to pull people towards the biological limits, they tend to get into wars, or they riot, or they do things, and the indirect consequences of what they do can start to bring the population back down. And I at least don't have the capacity to know how that's going to unfold. But I'd say there's a good chance, certainly during this century, that global population will come back down again. Well, we haven't invented new ways of raising the death rate. Famine, pestilence, and war. Those are the ones we have. They manifest differently depending on the technology that you're using, but that's the way. And it won't be just one thing, I don't think. It will be, it'll be a variety of things. Population is coming down in some areas because of deliberate decisions about fertility. It's coming down in other areas because people are starving to death. And I don't imagine we're going to flip over into a uniform, monotonic, global population. It's still going to be highly diverse. It may become more diverse. As we go into this period of transition, there will be a tendency for the gap between the rich and the poor to open up. The rich being relatively more effective at maintaining their situation than the poor. But I find, although it's sort of intellectually entertaining to think about those things, much more interesting to ask questions like, how can Santa Fe stabilize its population? You see, you have a very interesting dilemma here. Suppose that you are successful here in Santa Fe in achieving a very high living standard, that you make proactively the adjustments which are necessary to reduce your energy needs and pull your food dependence back inside your own region and stuff like that. The consequence of that will be in-migration. Most of you migrated here. Why? Because it's an attractive place. And if you succeed in solving these problems, you will be much more attractive than other places, and guess what? People will move in. And it is in the nature of this process that whatever your index of well-being is, it is, generally speaking, depressed as the population density goes up. So something is going to moderate inflows. Either you do it deliberately, or you do it because you don't do anything, and finally the attractiveness of this area sinks back down into equilibrium with its surroundings, and then people don't want to come here anymore. But in one way or another, you're going to have an influence on the decision about by people who want to move in here. Now, should you do it proactively, or should you just step back and wait to see what happens? That, this gets off into a whole set of value and political issues, which I wouldn't get into with a large audience. We could talk about it one-on-one. I don't know how it's going to unfold here. You are absolutely right. I remember in the 70s, there were global population conferences. There were U.S. aid programs to help people stabilize their population, lower their fertility. And over the last 30 years, the topic has become taboo. And we don't talk about it anymore. Even Obama is not able really to talk about these things. And if any mayor in Santa Fe, well, I mean, you had this recent example. Somebody got up and implemented a state immigration law. My gosh, it just triggered a phenomenal outcry. So, I mean, but here we are. So that's what we're working with, and now we need to move ahead. The fact is, population is going to go down. The fact is, you would prefer that most of the people live someplace else and not here. The fact is, you do things which govern migration, either deliberately or inadvertently. And so that's where we're at. And it's a question of what do you do next. Okay. Well, thank you all for your...